was just looking at the clock. I'm not doing as badly as I thought there, so I can tone it down a bit. I've got too many things on the go at the same time. Now the shutter, of course, was not cocking correctly. So that's a bit of a mystery. Don't know why at this stage. Doubtless we'll find out. The shutter blades are quite oily. You can see those stains around the edges of the blades there. That's oil. Certainly that's enough to stick things in place. Basically, when you've got polished surfaces like that, particularly thin ones, the oil just sticks them together and nothing is going anywhere. I think that we'll just jump in to the front and have a look. So I'll rotate that little lock. That allows me to rotate the front ring which bayonet's on, and I can see into the shutter. Can remove the shutter speed cam plate. Need to unhook this little spring here and unhook this spring from the main lever. This thing's called the main lever. Make sure it isn't trapped under that B lever. Let's have a look at the shutter now. What I'm interested in is whether the shutter blades are free to move. This lever here should move the blade actuating ring, which should open the shutter blades. And I noticed that lightly pressing on that, I can see one shutter blade twitching, the top one. The others don't twitch at all, which tells me that they're glued together. Now if I press on this hard enough, it'll probably open. I'm pressing quite hard, nothing's happening. Those blades are glued in there. That shutter is completely glued up with oil. So I'm just going to remove all the components until we dig down to the insides. While I'm at that stage, I'll take the outside off, I think. So the outer case here, we've got one screw here. That's the locator. That screw locates it in the camera body so that the shutter doesn't rotate when you're cocking the shutter. I'll just raise this piece slightly and no more, otherwise you'll damage something. I've got to undo that little lock screw there and allow the flash sync cable to release. That's released. So here's our curved rack that couples to the gear at the front of the camera, and this is the case, and there's a channel in there that curved rack runs inside. This little ring is the detents for our aperture settings. We're just checking the aperture now, the diaphragm, to see how that moves. Now that's quite stiff. There doesn't appear to be a great problem with it. I'm not seeing a lot of flexing of the blades, but it is stiffer than it should be, and again that will be oil. No question. The B lever, this is the B lever. I'm just going to unhook this spring, park that round there. I can probably unhook this end of the spring and let it float free too, if I can get under it. My pointy tweezers are blunt. Let's remove the B lever. The screw that holds it down has this spring on it. There's the B lever, lift that off there. This is the flash sync mechanism here. I'll just unhook this spring and this end. That flew across the table. Oh, I can see it, it hasn't even gone far. This is tight. All of these screws are quite small. They're certainly less than 2 millimeters in diameter. They're probably 1.2s to 1.6s or something. They're very tight for such small screws. Now let's lever this off. This plate with it fits over 2 points here, 2 shafts. So when you're lifting it, just be gentle prising that up. You can remove this little piece. And the moving flash contact can come off. The 500th of a second spring can come off. That little thing can come off. That drives the pallets. And here's the pallets. This is the pallet wheel. The flash sink. Right, so that tiny screw there, I need to get that out. And there'll be a tiny plastic slug in here that I don't want to lose. I'm just checking to make sure it's not sitting halfway between two areas. It appears to be entirely contained in that plastic flash contact here, the plastic block. That's some sort of styrene plastic. They're quite fragile, usually quite split and damaged. This one's not too bad. There's a tiny little loose plastic slug there, little round one. That's an insulator. It's quite important. It's exceptionally easy to lose. If you don't know it's there, you'll connect everything back up and you'll wonder why your electronic flash just fires as soon as you connect your flash to the camera. It'll be because you've shorted things out, because that plastic insulator wasn't where it should be. These 3 screws hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together, and often the shutter mechanism plate's often pretty stuck in here, particularly if everything's glued up with oil. There, we've got that off. Okay, this is the case. This has the diaphragm in it behind that retaining plate, and the other major section here is the mechanism plate. And here we have our shutter blades, and as you can see, those 4 blades are all glued together, just as I said. The first blade, the top blade, that was free. The others are all glued. And because they were glued, they couldn't open. And because they couldn't open, the blade actuating ring here couldn't move. So glued up shutter blades, certainly the problem there. That'll probably clean up okay. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there aren't residual marks from that having been glued together. Oil, as it ages, tends to lose all its volatiles. It probably oxidises or whatever happens to it. You end up with like a lacquer. Almost certainly where those oil stains are, you'll see residual marks. It won't just come off with the solvent. There'll be residual marks there, and that'll be because the oil is oxidised or done whatever it is that oils do, and that's effectively a lacquer. I'll just remove this screw, unhook that spring. This is the lever on the top of the shutter that moves the blade actuating ring. That was a bit reluctant to lift off there. Not sure why that should be. 2, 3, 4 screws here hold this retainer plate in place. 3 of them are short screws, 1 of them is a longer screw. The screws are fairly easily damaged. They're originally fitted with some substance like Loctite. They're reluctant to come out. Take great pains to keep lots and lots of downward pressure on a good screwdriver. You do not want it to cam out and damage those screw heads. And it certainly will unless you are very, very particular about your technique. This is a longer screw at this point. Take note of where the longer screw came from. I know it came from this end of the retard gear train. So there's a retainer plate, the blade actuating ring, and the mechanism plate bare, or as bare as we need it to be. Typically I do not take the retard gear train off the mechanism plate to clean it. Getting it set correctly, getting the adjustment set correctly is exceptionally tiresome. There's no need to do it if it was set correctly when the camera was first built or last time it was serviced. Then nothing will have changed. As long as you put the shutter back and everything is clean and working correctly, the speeds will be exactly as they should be. There's no great variables there you need to worry about. You can see this dried grease here, all that needs to come off. You need to get rid of all the grease that's on here. It'll have gone sticky with age and generally will not be doing a good job. That's the mechanism plate. Let's have a look at the shutter case. I'll swing this around until it exposes two screw heads through that cutout in the plate. Those two screw heads hold the aperture settings lever to the back of the shutter. So I'm supporting that on the edge of a block of wood so that I can apply reasonable pressure to that screw head as I unscrew that screw, and the same on the other side. This is where having an all-purpose block of wood is a very handy thing. Where did that screw go to? There it is. I need to get a new pair of tweezers. My good tweezers are rapidly getting not good. 3 screws hold the retainer plate in place. Now one of them is a countersunk screw, this one. That one's slightly loose. The other two are plain. You can tell where the countersunk head screw goes because there's a countersink for it to sink into. The case needs to be cleaned. The moving plate that swings the blades inwards or outwards needs to be cleaned. The blades, they're not too bad. They're not even particularly oily. You can tell that because as soon as I pick them up they fall apart, unlike the shutter blades that were glued together solidly. And the retainer plate, likewise, that's quite good. And interestingly, it's not covered in corrosion or fingerprints, which strongly suggests that this shutter has never been serviced. The camera looks like it had never really done much work. The shutter looks to me like it had never been serviced. So it means that probably the first person in here in 70 years. Right, all these bits need to be cleaned. But first a cup of coffee, I think. The diaphragm blades are going to be very easy. There's nothing really to worry about there. The shutter blades, they're oily. And I'm interested to see how well they clean up. Whether we're left with a lot of residual stains that I'll want to polish off, or whether they'll clean up quite well. That was the first blade, the one that wasn't stuck. Let's try this blade. That oil cleaned off there quite well. I might have no trouble at all with these blades. I'm checking these blades as I go to make sure that they are in fact coming clean. And they are looking good. There's certainly oil coming off on the cotton bud. Lucky last. See how it goes. I'm just using a toothpick here to hold the blade in position while I'm cleaning it, and I'm applying a minimum amount of force. I don't want to damage the blades in any way, which you can easily do if you poke and prod at them with something hard. Well, those blades are all good. Now that's fairly surprising to me, because they didn't look like they were going to be clean up particularly well, but they did. So I'll just put these blades to one side while I deal with the diaphragm. And the diaphragm, I don't expect to be any problem, because the blades here were honestly not very oily at all. They're not sticking together at all. There are marks on there, but they're not. They don't look like serious problems to me. So I'll clean up all these parts, and then you can watch me assemble it, because it's just not very exciting cleaning. I'll get this diaphragm assembled. I'll put the plate on there first. The plain side goes up. The blades aren't symmetrical. Make sure they're all sorted out so that the rivets, the pivots closer to the middle line of the blade, go into the fixed plate here. And the pivots closest to the corner of the blade, the outer corner of the blade, are going up. There are 10 blades to get in place. First 6 are easy, just one on top of the other. And then you have to start lifting blades away so that you've got access to the holes to put the other blades in place. There's number 6, the last of the easy ones. Just swing the end of the blade out to uncover those holes in the plate. That'll allow me to get the next 2 in place. Two to go. It's not uncommon to have to do this job multiple times, because you've slipped and knocked things flying while you're trying to get everything done. That's okay. Even if you have to do it multiple times, you'll get there eventually, and next time you'll be more careful. Right, now lift these blades up and swing them over those blades without disturbing anything. And hopefully everything remains seated where it should be. Now the moving plate goes on, and I know from experience it goes right here. I'm interested to see if all of those pivots line up smoothly. They're pretty good. Some of those aren't quite lined up. Let's see if I can pull them back. Yeah, looks like I've got all of the blades correctly positioned. I put the case on. It only goes on one place, of course, because the screw holes in here must match the positions here. Wiggle that on, flip it over, lift my jig off, slide it underneath. Why do none of those holes line up properly? Am I far out? No, not 100 miles. Yeah, that'll do. 3 little screws. One is the countersunk head screw. It's easy to find the home for that. The other 2 are plain. Doing these screws up very lightly because one or more of the blades could easily have become displaced with all that toing and froing, and you don't want to have a blade trapped underneath something when it should be seated in a socket. The pivots, I can see one pivot's not correctly positioned. Let's do those screws up very lightly. Let's have a look. This one here is not seated. Now it is. That looks okay. Do those screws up lightly. Check that the diaphragm moves smoothly. It does. That's all good. That was successful. I can do the 3 screws up snug. And the settings lever can go in place. So I'll swing this round until that hole lines up in the case through here. Here's my settings lever. I'm just going to wipe a bit of molybdenum paste on this so it moves smoothly. Wipe around the inside and wipe that top surface. That's where it comes against the case here. I know that the lever has got to be down at the bottom. These cutouts are at the top, so I can swing that round until I see the holes line up, which is right there. Find one of my little shoulder screws, which is busy trying to hide. Get that in there, run that in place. That's held there firmly. Now let's find this other one that's hiding between the paper. Just support this on the edge of the block of wood. Drop that second screw down into that hole. Why's that sticking? My tweezers become magnetised. They might have done. That's a curse. Run that screw down, snug it up. Support the other side on the block of wood now. Tighten that screw up. Check that the setting lever moves smoothly. It does. It's smoother than it was to start off with. Not a lot, I have to say, but I'm quite happy, of course, now that I know for sure that the blades are clean, free from any contamination of oil, and the resistance I feel is just the resistance of this settings lever on the back of the case, and you don't want it too free anyway. here's the mechanism plate. Now the mechanism plate, I've had this apart, cleaned it, lubricated it with a bit of graphite powder, and everything is going well. So I'm just going to unhook that, swing this lever into the blade's open position and fit the shutter blades. One of the shutter blades has an extra hole in it, simply to identify it as blade number 1. And blade number 1 goes here. The other blades are all identical, and they're identical to that one apart from its extra hole. I'm not sure why there was an enthusiasm to have a blade labelled so carefully. Probably had some historical significance once upon a time, possibly for a very brief time, and it might be something that was entirely useless after that point. Some people are a bit pedantic about it. They move the blades around and want to match them to position as though they were pistons being matched to a bore, so the wear pattern would match, but I think that's really just a load of crap, to put it nicely. Here's the case. The case can go on. I'm just going to get this round in a position where I can see everything and just remove that little thread of cotton that shouldn't be there. Put the case over. I'm lining this up. I can see the little rectangular hole here in the mechanism plate and the case, and that tells me that I've got the two lined up. There's 3 screws that hold the mechanism plate and the case together, so I'll just run them in lightly. Yeah, the mechanism plate and the case didn't want to separate when I took the thing apart. It may well be that the mechanism plate's not seating fully. Sometimes that can happen. Sometimes there can be, the case can be slightly out of shape. It just catches on something, it's rubbing. It'll stop things falling down into place. We'll find out shortly. Notice that screw is not lining up. Yep, it's going to need a wriggle. What's going on? Yeah, that just seated. It was not sitting down flush. Let's run those screws down lightly and check that the blades didn't hop off their pins while that was happening. Nope, they're good. I can hook the return spring in place and do the 3 screws up. So we've got our diaphragm blades in place, we've got our shutter blades in place, and unlike earlier, they're nice and snappy in their action. There's no great resistance at all. That's just ideal. The flash sync connector needs to go in now. The flash contact, and as I said, this is just a styrene plastic. Inevitably they're somewhat split and broken at the end as this one is, so trying to get it down inside the square hole is often difficult because they are no longer square. Yeah, that's seated with a minimum amount of fuss. And I'll get its fixing screw in place. check that that black insulating slug is pushed back out of the way. That's good. And I'll put that tiny screw in there to make sure it doesn't fall out from the outside while we're working on the shutter. Oh, that's a magnetised screwdriver. Well, if it's going to be magnetised, we'll make it work for its living. It's good. Just checking that that plastic insulator slug is not pushed back so far it would obstruct the wire going in. No, that looks good. Okay, so far so good. The retard gear train, I lubricated that lightly with graphite powder once it was clean too, so that's all good. Some of this flash sink componentry needs to be sorted out next. So this stuff I haven't cleaned yet. The flash contact, I don't need to do anything with that. More the problem is the pallet. I need to make sure that that's free from any old grease and rubbish, because that will tend to make it rattle its way along somewhat slower than it should. That looks good. So the pallets go in, and one surface of them is slightly rounded off, just from the way it was pressed, I think, but that rounded off surface should be at the top. It sits on a raised boss below there, so the sharp edges of the underside do not rub on anything. But if you turn it upside down, that surface might rub on something. Now the little wheel that drives the pallet wheel is here, and I just want to lubricate the toe of that cam on here lightly with a wipe of molybdenum paste, because that's where the moving flash contact arm runs across that surface, and it's quite a steep rise. I don't want that being unduly rough. The 1/500th of a second speed spring can go on. I'll just wipe through the centre of that with some molybdenum paste for good measure. Not that I think it makes a hell of a lot of difference. And our flash contact, moving flash contact, is here. I'll swing that into position, making sure it's not sitting on top of that, the toe of that cam, because that would end up bending things. And getting that reshaped if it's bent is no fun. So I'll get its fixing screw in place.